What if one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world had never heard of Hanukkah, never studied the Talmud, never even spoke Hebrew? High in the misty highlands of Ethiopia, a people lived cut off from the Jewish world for centuries. They called themselves Beta Israel, the House of Israel. But their Judaism looked nothing like the one practiced in Europe or the Middle East. They kept the Sabbath, observed Passover, read the 5 books of Moses, but they also followed forgotten texts like the Book of Jubilees. Their prayers were chanted in Ge'ez, a language so ancient it predates most modern alphabets. They had no rabbis, no oral law, no knowledge of Hanukkah or Purim. To most outsiders, they didn't fit the image of Jews at all. And yet they claimed descent from the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. For years, historians dismissed their story as folklore, a survival myth. Maybe they were Christian converts. Maybe they just adopted Jewish customs over time. That was the assumption, until science stepped in. In 2021, a sweeping genetic study shook the conversation. It showed that Beta Israel are overwhelmingly 80% of East African origin Cushitic-speaking groups like the Aga. But the surprise came in the minority markers. 20% of their DNA showed unmistakable links to ancient Middle Eastern populations. Even more stunning, a significant number of Beta Israel men carried the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic signature historically associated with the Jewish priesthood, said to trace back to Aaron, Moses' brother. This wasn't just oral tradition anymore, it was written into their blood. How did a Semitic priestly lineage end up in the Ethiopian highlands? Who were the first Jews to reach these mountains and when? Was this a migration, a mission, or something else entirely? And if their Jewish identity is that ancient, why did the world forget them? Because the next chapter in this mystery reaches beyond DNA into royal legends, sacred relics, and a lost ark said to still rest in Aksum, under lock and under shadow. And that's not just a legend whispered in village stories. It's printed, word for word, in the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's 14th century royal chronicle, revered like scripture itself. According to this epic, more than 2,900 years ago, Queen Makeda of Sheba journeyed to Jerusalem. There, she met King Solomon. Their union brief but transformative produced a son, Menelik I. Raised in Ethiopia but drawn back to his father's kingdom, Menelik returned from Israel not just with priests and nobles, but with something else. The Ark of the Covenant. Yes, that Ark. The one said to hold the 10 Commandments. The divine artifact said to destroy armies, bring plagues, and collapse cities. The Kebra claims it was stolen, or perhaps gifted and carried south to Aksum, hidden from the world ever since. And to this day, Ethiopians believe the Ark still rests inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. No visitors allowed. Only one guardian priest may look upon it, and he never leaves its side. Is it myth? A brilliant tool to legitimize a dynasty? Or is it something more, a coded record of a forgotten exodus? Because whether or not the physical ark sits in that chamber, the impact of this story is real. It shaped the Solomonic dynasty, justified centuries of kingship. It gave Ethiopia a sacred tether to Jerusalem, and gave Beta Israel a bloodline that could not be questioned. But here's where it gets stranger. Because, while emperors clung to Menelik and the Ark, Beta Israel told another origin story. Not about stolen relics, not about royal blood. Theirs was older, quieter. A tale whispered by priests in the mountains of a tribe that left Israel not because of politics, but because they had no choice. And their version doesn't begin in Aksum. It begins in exile. It begins in the fall of the Northern Kingdom. Because outside royal legends, another, even older story emerged. One, the Beta Israel, told only among themselves. That story didn't speak of kings but of exile. Not of glory but of survival. It begins centuries before Menelik, before Aksum, before the Ark. 722 BCE, the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. The Assyrians swept in. 10 tribes vanished from the map. One of them was the tribe of Dan. And if you believe the voice of Eldad Hadani, a Jewish traveler from the 9th century, they didn't vanish. They fled. Eldad claimed he had met Danites. Not in Babylon, not in Egypt, but in Africa, beyond the Nile. According to his account, they had escaped the Assyrians, crossed into Egypt, and journeyed deep into the land of Cush, ancient Nubia, modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. He spoke of a self-ruled Jewish kingdom, isolated but faithful, practicing Mosaic law, speaking Hebrew, keeping to themselves. Was Eldad a fantasist? Or did he glimpse something no one else was willing to believe? Because around the same time, another source appeared. Zephaniah 3:10, a prophecy, written around 630 BCE. It reads, "From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers will bring offerings to me." It doesn't say Babylon. It doesn't say Persia. It says Cush, the biblical name for the land south of Egypt. And then, the silence begins. For centuries, we hear nothing, until medieval maps and memoirs start whispering of a Jewish kingdom in the Ethiopian highlands, the Kingdom of Simeon. 12th century Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela mentioned Jews living in the mountains. Marco Polo echoed the rumor. Christian missionaries called them Kama Ihud, like Jews, not quite Jews, not quite not. To the Ethiopian Empire, they were heretics. To rabbinic authorities, an anomaly. Too isolated, too different, too African. They followed a law stripped of Talmud. They spoke no Hebrew. But still, they clung to a name that carried weight, Beta Israel. And the question grows louder. If they were just converts, how did they know about the tribe of Dan? Why did their origin stories match a man from the 9th century? And how did their rituals echo a Judaism older than Babylon itself? Because maybe, just maybe, these stories weren't oral myths. Maybe they were genetically encoded. And now, science had the chance to speak. In 2021, researchers from Nature Communications published a massive genome study over 1,200 Ethiopians sampled across 68 ethnic groups. Among them were Beta Israel. The results stunned even seasoned geneticists. Around 80% of their DNA aligned with indigenous East African populations, mainly Cushitic-speaking groups like the Aga, native to the Ethiopian highlands. But it was the remaining 20% that changed everything. Within that sliver of their genome were unmistakable traces of Semitic ancestry, genetic signals pointing toward ancient populations in the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and even parts of Egypt. It wasn't a vague similarity. These were distinct ancestral layers, markers that appeared in Jewish and Near Eastern groups, but nowhere else in Ethiopia. And then came the biggest twist. Among Beta Israel men, scientists found a significant frequency of the Cohen modal haplotype. It's a Y chromosome lineage most often associated with the Jewish priesthood traced back, through oral and genetic tradition, to Aaron, brother of Moses. It's found among Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi Jews. And now, in a remote African community that had never seen a Talmud. How? These weren't people who picked up Judaism in the 15th century. Their rituals lacked all post-biblical influence. No Purim, no Hanukkah, no rabbis. Just the 5 books of Moses, the book of Enoch, and centuries of isolation. If they were converts, they had to be among the oldest in history and deeply influenced by something or someone. Because you don't find Semitic priestly DNA and ancient Hebrew customs in mountain villages by accident. It's as if a spark and ember had traveled from ancient Israel across the Red Sea. Fanned by wind, kept alive in silence, it settled in the highlands. And over generations, it reignited. A faith, reborn in exile. But here's the haunting question that genetic data alone can't answer. If these people didn't arrive with a migrating Israelite tribe, then who brought them the law? Who taught them Judaism before the world even knew they were there? Some scholars believe the answer doesn't lie in migration, but in slow, quiet transformation. The Cushite conversion theory. It doesn't start with a tribe leaving Israel. It starts with locals becoming something new. According to this view, it wasn't the Israelites who came in droves, it was fragments. Traders, wanderers, priests on the edge of memory. And they didn't convert a kingdom. They planted a seed. Over time, the Aga people of the Ethiopian highlands, farmers, herders, craftsmen, began to adopt practices that weren't theirs. They stopped eating pork. They began observing the Sabbath. Some even started building places of worship that faced west, toward a land they had never seen. And remarkably, traces of those practices are still seen among non-Jewish Ethiopians today. In dietary laws, in purity rituals, even in how they sanctify time. But the Beta Israel went further. Their faith, called Haymanot, is unlike anything else in the Jewish world. No Talmud, no oral law, just the Torah plus ancient books like Enoch and Jubilees, texts long forgotten by mainstream Judaism. Their version of kashrut comes straight from Leviticus. They don't mix milk and meat, but not because of rabbinic tradition, because of the raw, literal words in Scripture. This isn't modern Judaism. This is something older, sharper, preserved in mountain wind and oral memory like a time capsule sealed just after the Second Temple fell. It echoes Karaite Judaism, but it's not Karaite. It shares Mosaic law, but lacks the scholarly fingerprints of Europe or Babylon. It's a form of Judaism shaped not by debate but by survival. Imagine a priest standing barefoot in a stone hut, chanting scripture in Ge'ez, his voice rising into the silence. No synagogue, no yeshiva. Just him, his scroll, and the rhythm of something ancient. And all this for centuries while the rest of the Jewish world moved on. But the world around them didn't stay quiet forever. Because as Christianity rose in Axum, the Jews refused to kneel. That choice, quiet, defiant, absolute, changed everything. In the 4th century CE, under King Ezana, the Aksumite Empire became one of the first nations in the world to declare Christianity the state religion. Crosses replaced sun discs. Churches rose where old temples once stood. The empire shifted its center politically, spiritually, violently. But Beta Israel didn't follow. They wouldn't convert, wouldn't abandon their Torah, wouldn't let go of laws written in blood, memory, and exile. So they ran into the northwestern mountains, into the Simeon Highlands, a place so steep, so remote, even armies hesitated to climb. There, they did something remarkable. They built fortresses out of stone, isolated communities where no outsiders ruled. Every village had its own kahen, a priest. Every family was bound by Mosaic law. They called their synagogues masjids. Their customs grew sharper, stricter, a defense against the world pressing in. They didn't just survive. They resisted through faith. And in the shadows of this resistance, a legend grew. Her name was Gudit. Some say she was a Jewish queen. Others call her a myth. But what's whispered is this. She rose from the margins, and in the 10th century, she marched on Aksum, burned its churches, toppled its kings, ended a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. Whether she was real or mythologized, her story struck deep into Ethiopia's memory. Because it wasn't just about revenge, it was about power, about people pushed too far for too long. But rebellion had a price. Beta Israel became targets, feared for their rituals, blamed for misfortune. Their craftsmen, blacksmiths, tanners, potters were called Buddha, not just outcasts, not just Jews. Evil-eyed, capable of curses, witchcraft, something less than human. And yet they endured, sealed in stone villages, whispering scripture in Ge'ez, holding the line. But empires don't stay silent forever, because the next war that came for them wasn't fought with swords. It came through laws, through baptism, through erasure. And then came the war of fire. Not on the battlefield, but against their souls. The fire came in stages. Centuries after Queen Gudit's rebellion, a new threat emerged not from invaders, but from the empire's own throne. In 1446, Emperor Yeshak declared that the Jews of Ethiopia had two options: baptism or destruction. His armies swept into the highlands. Synagogues were seized, farmlands confiscated, thousands of Beta Israel were killed, enslaved, or scattered. Their identity was criminalized, their survival uncertain. A century later, it only got worse. In the early 1602, under Emperor Susenyos, Christianity became the hammer. Influenced by Jesuit missionaries, Susenyos embraced Catholicism and launched a new wave of conversions, this time more aggressive, more systematic. Whole villages were baptized at sword point. Ritual books were burned. Scrolls vanished into hiding places carved into mountain stone. And it's here the name Falasha took root. It meant outsider, exile, landless. But to Beta Israel, it meant being erased not just from land, but from history. Still, they resisted. Not with armies, but with memory. They formed hidden priestly schools, passed down scripture in Ge'ez by whisper and repetition. And when they could no longer build temples, they built rituals. One of them was Sigd, a festival not found in any other Jewish tradition. Once a year, they fasted, climbed the highest peaks, and prayed facing Jerusalem. A reminder to themselves, to their children, that they hadn't forgotten where they came from. By the late 17th century, Beta Israel had been pushed to the margins of Ethiopia. Economically restricted, religiously banned, politically invisible. And yet, they still lit the fire. But isolation cuts deep. With every generation, the distance from global Judaism grew. No Hebrew, no access to rabbinic texts, no contact with Jews from Babylon or Spain or Europe. Over time, even their DNA began to reflect their seclusion with less genetic diversity and fewer outside influences. They remembered the law, but the world forgot them. And inside that silence, something began to fade. Not their faith, but the memory in their blood. Because when centuries pass without contact, even DNA starts to forget. But language forgets faster. For generations, Beta Israel preserved scripture in Ge'ez, the sacred liturgical language of Ethiopia. Not spoken in daily life, not heard in marketplaces, only in prayer, in ritual, in the rhythmic chant of priests reciting lines passed down by memory, not manuscript. There was no Hebrew, no Yiddish, no Ladino, no Jewish vernacular tied them to the rest of the diaspora. Instead, their everyday speech evolved with the mountains. They spoke Guaranya, a nearly extinct dialect of Aga origin. Others adopted Amharic, the imperial tongue of Ethiopia. Over time, even Ge'ez became less understood, recited, but not always translated. The words survived, the meanings blurred. Imagine a boy learning the commandments from a priest who cannot explain the grammar. Imagine a wedding song sung in Ge'ez, whose verses are older than the guests and older than their memory. The prayers echo through stone chambers, but the language they carry has no living nation. It's a ritual fossil, a snapshot of Semitic Judaism before the rabbis, before the diaspora splintered into tongues. And it made Beta Israel feel even more isolated, not just from Ethiopia, but from the Jewish world waiting beyond the sea. Because when they began arriving in Israel, airlifted in waves during the late 20th century, something strange happened. They had returned to Zion, but not to the Hebrew they once knew. Many couldn't read street signs. Others sat in open classes, learning a language they believed their ancestors spoke, yet feeling like strangers in the land of their prophecy. One elder said it best, "We remembered the covenant, but not the words." And that gap between memory and voice became another border. One more barrier in a long journey home. Because even in the Promised Land, they were welcomed, but not entirely accepted. The dream of Zion was never meant to come with a form to fill out. In 1984, as famine crushed northern Ethiopia and civil war tore the nation apart, a quiet mission unfolded beneath the world's radar. Mossad agents, aid workers, diplomats, they coordinated in shadows. And then, with almost biblical speed, the sky opened. Operation Moses. In just 7 weeks, nearly 8,000 Ethiopian Jews were airlifted from Sudan to Israel. Men who had walked barefoot across deserts. Women who had buried children on the road. Elders clutching Torah scrolls written in Ge'ez. stepping onto planes they believed were angels. They thought the journey was over. But for many, it was just beginning. Because when they landed, starved, exhausted, relieved, they were met not with celebration, but with suspicion. "Are you really Jewish?" they were asked. Not by strangers, by rabbis. Israel's religious authorities didn't recognize Haymanot, the ancient faith of Beta Israel, as fully Jewish under halakhic law. Many were told to undergo symbolic conversions. Men were recircumcised. Women dunked in ritual mikvahs. Their traditions were questioned. Their identity was placed on trial. Operation Moses was just the beginning. In 1991, as Ethiopia's regime collapsed, Operation Solomon followed in one night. 14,325 Ethiopian Jews were evacuated, 40 planes in 36 hours, babies born midair. Scrolls tucked beneath jackets. It was one of the largest humanitarian airlifts in history. But once again, joy met disillusionment. They were home, yes, but their music, their food, their faith all felt foreign in the land they had prayed for. Schools labeled them backward. Housing kept them separate. Some were assigned new Hebrew names. Others simply disappeared into silence. And yet, they endured. Because despite everything, bureaucracy, doubt, racism, they had made it to Jerusalem. The city whispered in their sig prayers for centuries. The city that had only ever existed in song. But the journey isn't over. Because even now, in the mountains of Ethiopia, after the airlifts, after the famine, after the world moved on, some still remain. But those who stayed weren't just forgotten, they were complicated. They are called Falash Mura, the shadow cousins of Beta Israel. Their ancestors, once Jewish, had converted to Christianity under imperial pressure. Some out of fear, some out of hunger, some simply to survive. But the memory didn't die. Decades passed. Generations changed. And then, something stirred. In the 1992nd, as Israel began welcoming waves of Ethiopian Jews under the law of return, the Falash Mura stood up and asked to come too. Not as strangers, as family. They still followed Jewish customs, fasting on Yom Kippur, lighting candles, reading what scraps remained of Gia's scripture. Their children bore Beta Israel names. Their hearts turned to Jerusalem. Their DNA? Nearly indistinguishable from those already flown to Israel. But halakhic law hesitated. These weren't Jews by tradition, they had broken the chain. Converted, then returned. Some rabbinical courts said no. Others said, maybe. Proof was demanded, conversions required. And so they waited. In cramped compounds in Gondar and Addis Ababa, thousands waited for decades. Mothers separated from sons. Brothers living in Tel Aviv, while sisters remained behind wire fences in Ethiopia. Not because of war, but because of paperwork. Family photos became divided timelines. Half of a wedding in Israel. The other half is in exile. And through it all, a deeper question burned. If Judaism is in your blood, but not in your passport, are you still a Jew? If your ancestors stood at Sinai, but your documents say otherwise, do you belong? Some were eventually allowed to return. Thousands were not, and even those who arrived still carried the sting of having to prove what they never stopped believing. But beneath the politics, the theology, the bureaucracy, a mystery remained. Because Beta Israel held onto Judaism through exile, or rediscovered it through fire. One question never left the shadows. What is the true origin of Beta Israel? Maybe that question misunderstands the answer. Because the story of Beta Israel isn't one single thread, it's a woven tapestry. Cushitic roots, Jewish law, Gia's liturgy, exile, return, survival. It's not about a starting point. It's about what endured. Genetic studies confirm their primary ancestry lies in the Aga native highland people of Ethiopia, but that's only part of the truth. Layered into their DNA are unmistakable. Semitic signals, mitochondrial traces from the Near East, Y chromosomes linked to the ancient Kohanim line. These aren't just genetic echoes. They're clues. Residual whispers of a link far older than paperwork and deeper than politics. And then, there's the religion Haymanot. No Babylonian Talmud, no rabbinic commentaries, just raw Torah, the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, Leviticus, memorized and sung for centuries. Their Judaism didn't evolve the way others did. It held still, like a photograph of Second Temple worship sealed in mountain stone. In a world where most Jewish communities adapted, rewrote, argued, Beta Israel preserved, even their rituals carry the scent of antiquity. Circumcisions on the 8th day, priestly orders called kahen, sacred texts passed down in GS, a liturgical language no longer spoken but never forgotten. Today, their children speak Hebrew. They study in Israeli schools. Many no longer read Ge'ez. But the scrolls remain, some hand-copied by candlelight, others wrapped in cloth, smuggled through war zones. Physical proof of faith stitched across continents. And here lies the twist. Maybe they weren't born Israelites. Maybe they became Israelites through centuries of fire and refusal to let go. Because ancestry isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the stories you carry, the laws you never stopped keeping, the mountains you left but never erased. So now we must ask the question differently. Not where Beta Israel came from, but what they became. And if identity can survive in the highlands of Ethiopia without language, without a flag, without recognition, what does that say about ours? Next we head south, past Nubian pyramids, into a desert silence where ancient synagogues once stood. The lost Jews of Sudan.